Imagine you are the captain of a Spanish merchant vessel somewhere in the Caribbean Sea in the year 1710. The wind is good. Your cargo hold is full of silver. Your crew is relaxed. And then, somewhere off your port bow, a shape emerges from the shadow of a coastal headland. It is moving fast, faster than anything that size has any right to move. Before your lookout can even call it down, it has closed half the distance between you. That shape was a brigantine. And if you were a merchant captain in the early 18th century, it was the last thing you wanted to see. Today, we are going to break down exactly why the brigantine became the weapon of choice for the most dangerous pirates of the Golden Age. Not just what it looked like, but how it actually worked. Why it was faster, why it was harder to catch, why it could hide where other ships could not, and how pirates took an already fast vessel and turned it into something even more lethal. Because this is not just a story about wood and sail. This is a story about how a relatively small, relatively cheap ship fundamentally changed who controlled the seas. Let's go back to the beginning. The brigantine did not start its life as a pirate ship. Nothing that became infamous in the golden age of piracy started out that way. The brigantine was a working vessel, a merchant and patrol ship that had been evolving in European shipyards since at least the 16th century. Its name comes from the Italian word brigantino, which essentially meant a vessel used by brigands or raiders, which tells you something right there. Even before pirates got their hands on it, people understood that this ship had a certain edge to it. By the early 1700s, the brigantine had settled into a fairly consistent design. 2 masts. The foremast carried square sails, which were your power sails, the ones that caught the full face of the wind and drove you forward in open ocean conditions. The mainmast carried a fore and aft rig, meaning sails that ran lengthwise along the ship rather than across it. This combination was unusual. Most ships of the era committed to one rigging philosophy or the other. The brigantine did both. That hybrid setup was not an accident. It was a calculated engineering choice, and it gave the brigantine something almost no other ship of its size could claim: flexibility. Think about what a square-rigged ship can do. When the wind is behind you or off your quarter, those big square sails fill like balloons and push you through the water at serious speed. An experienced crew working a square-rigged brigantine downwind could hit somewhere between 8 and 12 knots in good conditions. For the early 18th century, that was genuinely fast. But the problem with pure square rigging is what happens when the wind shifts, when you need to tack, when you need to come at an angle to the wind or move in tight, confined water. Square-rigged ships were notoriously clumsy at this. You needed a lot of sea room, a lot of crew, a lot of time. The fore and aft sails on the mainmast solved that problem. They let the brigantine point much higher into the wind, maybe 45 to 60 degrees off the wind direction compared to the 75 or more degrees that a pure square rigger needed. In practical terms, that meant a brigantine could work in conditions where other ships were helpless. It could zigzag through island chains. It could sail into a headwind in a way that looked almost impossible. It could be where you did not expect it to be, and it could leave before you could respond. This is the foundation of everything we are going to talk about today. The brigantine's hybrid rig was not just an engineering curiosity. It was the reason pirates chose it above almost anything else. But speed and maneuverability were only part of the picture. The brigantine had another structural advantage that is less talked about, but equally important: its draft. Draft refers to how deep a ship's hull extends below the waterline. A large warship of the period, something like a fourth-rate ship of the line, might draw 18 to 20 feet of water below the surface. Even a medium-sized frigate would draw 10 to 14 feet. These ships needed deep water. They could not approach shallow coastlines. They could not enter river mouths. They could not hide in the coves and inlets that dotted the Caribbean coastline. The Bahamas, the Carolina coast, the waters around Madagascar, and the Indian Ocean islands. A brigantine typically drew somewhere between 6 and 10 feet of water, sometimes less, depending on the specific vessel and how lightly it was loaded. That number does not sound impressive until you realize what it meant operationally. It meant that a brigantine could sail into places where a naval warship physically could not follow. It could anchor in a river mouth, behind a sandbar that would ground a frigate in seconds. It could sit in a mangrove-lined cove, invisible from the open sea, while a naval patrol ship sailed right past on the horizon. Pirates did not just use this as an escape route. They used it as a tactical weapon. We will come back to that. Now, all of this sounds good on paper, but there is a question worth asking. If the brigantine was so effective, why did not everyone use it? Why were not navies running fleets of brigantines? The answer is capacity. A typical brigantine of the Golden Age era was somewhere between 50 and 150 tons of displacement. Its crew ran from about 30 to as many as 100 sailors, depending on configuration and purpose. It could carry a handful of cannon, typically between 4 and 16 guns, depending heavily on how you modified it and what you were willing to sacrifice in terms of cargo space. That was not a lot of firepower by naval standards. A warship of the period could carry 60, 80, even 100 guns. A brigantine bringing 8 or 10 guns to a fight against a naval vessel of any real size was going to lose that fight. But pirates were not looking to fight naval vessels. They were looking to catch merchant ships. And against a merchant vessel, a brigantine was almost perfectly designed. Merchant ships of the period were built for capacity, not speed. They were floating warehouses. They sat low in the water under the weight of their cargo. They were crewed minimally to keep operating costs down. They were not built to outrun anything because they were not supposed to need to. The system of naval protection was supposed to handle that. The brigantine could run down almost any merchant vessel it wanted. And if a merchant captain looked at that two-masted shape bearing down on them and made the rational decision to heave to and surrender rather than die in a fight they were going to lose anyway, well, that was the whole point. The threat of violence was often enough. The brigantine was fast enough that running was not a serious option. And just visible enough, just ominous enough in silhouette, that it did the psychological work before a single cannon was fired. That brings us to the people who understood all of this best, the pirates themselves. The Golden Age of piracy is generally dated from around 1650 to 1730, though the most intense period of brigantine-based raiding runs roughly from 1700 to 1725. This is the era we are talking about, the era of Nassau as a pirate base, of the Bahamas before Woodes Rogers arrived to clean it up, of the West African coast and the Indian Ocean routes, where ships loaded with East India Company goods were just waiting to be taken. The pirates who operated in this world were not random criminals. Many of them were former naval men or privateers, sailors who understood ships deeply and who made deliberate, informed choices about what vessel they used for what purpose. And a significant number of them landed on the brigantine as their preferred platform. Let's talk about Benjamin Hornigold first. Hornigold is one of the founding figures of the Nassau pirate base that historians call the Republic of Pirates, the loose community of sea raiders who operated out of the Bahamas in the 17-teens. Hornigold ran brigantines almost exclusively during his most active years. He understood something fundamental about the Caribbean theater. The islands were everywhere. The shallows were everywhere. Naval presence was thin and spread out. A fast, shallow draft ship was not just an advantage, it was practically a necessity. Hornigold used the brigantine the way a good infantry commander uses terrain. He picked his hiding spots carefully. He studied the routes that Spanish and English merchant vessels used. He knew where the ships would be funneled by wind patterns and geography, places like the Windward Passage between Cuba and Hispaniola, or the approaches to ports like Havana and Cartagena, where loaded ships coming and going were predictable as clockwork. He would anchor in shallow water where Navy ships could not follow, wait for the right target, emerge at the optimal moment, and use the brigantine's speed to close before the merchant had time to make a decision. Hornigold was also, notably, one of the people who taught his methods to a young sailor you have definitely heard of. A man who, at this point in his career, was sailing as a crew member and officer under Hornigold's command before eventually going on to his own infamy. We will get to him shortly. But first, Let's understand what pirates actually did to their brigantines to make them even more effective. Because they did not take these ships as delivered, they modified them. The first thing a pirate crew typically did when they acquired a brigantine was lighten it. Merchant brigantines carried cargo. Cargo is weight. Weight costs you speed. Pirates stripped out cargo infrastructure, removed internal partitioning, took out anything that was not directly useful for combat or sailing. Every unnecessary pound thrown overboard was a fraction of a knot gained. On a ship where your entire strategic advantage was speed, fractions added up. Second, they modified the gun arrangement. Standard brigantines of the period were not heavily armed, but pirates reconfigured the available gun positions to maximize what they called chase capability. Chase guns were cannon-mounted at the very bow of the ship, pointing forward. When you were chasing a merchant vessel, you could fire these guns even while at full sail, sending cannonballs past or into the fleeing ship. The point was not necessarily to destroy the vessel. It was to convince the captain that continuing to flee was more dangerous than stopping. A chase gun round through your mainsail or across your deck was a very persuasive argument. Similarly, pirates sometimes mounted stern chasers at the back of the ship, guns pointing aft. These were for when the situation flipped and you were the one being chased. Fire your stern chasers, damage your pursuer's rigging or sails, slow them down just enough to increase the gap. Combined with the brigantine's shallow draft allowing you to head for water your pursuer could not enter, stern chasers gave you multiple escape options even in difficult situations. Third, pirates paid enormous attention to their rigging. The rigging of a sailing ship, the ropes, blocks, and spars that controlled the sails, was essentially the ship's nervous system. Well-maintained, well-tuned rigging meant sails that set faster, responded quicker, and delivered more power to the hull. Pirate crews, often full of experienced former naval and merchant sailors, maintained their rigging with obsessive care. A brigantine with perfectly tuned rigging in the hands of an experienced crew was meaningfully faster than the same ship sailed badly. This is where we talk about tactics, because the hardware is only half of it. The tactical doctrine that pirates developed around the brigantine was sophisticated, and understanding it helps explain why so many encounters ended the way they did. The most important tactical concept was windward advantage. In the age of sail, controlling the wind gauge, meaning positioning yourself upwind of your target, gave you massive control over the engagement. If you were upwind, you could choose when and whether to close. You could run down on a target whenever you wanted. The target, sailing into the wind to reach you, would always be fighting against their own sails. The brigantine's ability to point high into the wind, thanks to that fore and aft mainmast rig, meant pirates could work to gain windward position even when it was not obvious they were doing so. A merchant captain watching a ship sail at an angle might not immediately realize that ship was maneuvering for position. By the time they understood what was happening, the brigantine had the weather gauge and the engagement was already dictated by the pirate. The second major tactic was the ambush from the shallows. We have talked about the brigantine's shallow draft. Pirates used this to stage ambushes that naval officers at the time found almost impossible to counter effectively. They would anchor in a cove or behind an island, sometimes with their sails down so there was barely anything visible above the tree line. They would send a lookout to a high point on the island to watch the sea lanes. When a target was spotted, the crew would emerge, get sail up quickly, and be moving at speed before the merchant vessel could even identify what was happening. The timing was everything. By the time the target saw the brigantine clearly, it was often already too late to run. The third tactic was psychological, and it built on the first two. Pirates cultivated a reputation, deliberately and carefully. The brigantine's distinctive silhouette became a symbol. Two masts, that particular sail configuration, moving fast. Experienced merchant captains knew what they were looking at when they saw it. And the reputation of specific pirates, spread through port gossip, newspapers, and the testimony of survivors, made the decision to fight even less appealing. If you had heard stories about what happened when crews resisted, and those stories were sometimes accurate and sometimes exaggerated, but always terrifying, you were a lot more likely to lower your sails when that brigantine closed on you. If you are finding this deep dive interesting, go ahead and subscribe. We cover naval history and the golden age of piracy regularly on this channel, and there is a lot more to come. Now, we promised you the man Hornigold taught, and if you know anything about golden age piracy, you already know who we are talking about. Edward Teach, better known as Blackbeard, is the most famous pirate in history. His face is on merchandise and theme park rides and film franchises. But before he became the mythological figure we know today, before Queen Anne's revenge and the blockade of Charleston and the final battle in Ocracoke Inlet, he was a brigantine captain. Blackbeard served under Hornigold during the early Nassau years and eventually received his own command, a brigantine. He spent a significant period of his active pirate career operating smaller vessels in the brigantine class before eventually capturing the French slave ship Concorde in late 1717 and converting it into the much larger flagship he called Queen Anne's Revenge. But his instincts, his tactical thinking, his understanding of how to use speed and surprise and psychological pressure were all formed during the brigantine years. The large ship was a statement of power and ambition. The brigantine was the school, and Blackbeard was not the only major figure shaped by brigantine operations. Bartholomew Roberts, who is arguably even more impressive as a maritime raider than Blackbeard in terms of raw numbers, took a different approach to the vessel. Roberts, at the height of his career, between 1719 and 1722, captured somewhere between 400 and 470 vessels, depending on which historical account you consult. That number is almost incomprehensible. It puts him among the most prolific raiders in the entire history of the Golden Age. Roberts used multiple vessel types throughout his career, but his operational philosophy was rooted in the brigantine approach, even when sailing larger ships. Speed, positioning, the threat display before the actual fight, the careful selection of targets, the use of geography. These were not just pirate intuition, they were brigantine doctrine, scaled up and applied across a broader operational range. But let us talk about someone who is less famous than Blackbeard or Roberts, but whose career is almost a textbook demonstration of how brigantine tactics worked at their finest. Charles Vane is one of the harder figures to pin down in Golden Age piracy. He was not particularly beloved even among other pirates. He was known as stubborn, aggressive in ways that were sometimes counterproductive, and willing to fight when more cautious pirates would have avoided a confrontation. But as a brigantine operator in the Bahamas and Caribbean theater, he was exceptionally capable. Vane was one of the last pirate captains to leave Nassau when Woodes Rogers arrived with a royal pardon in 1718. He left in a spectacularly theatrical way, firing guns at Rogers' fleet as he sailed out, a gesture that was both defiant and operationally sound. He knew he could not stay. So he left fast, and in a brigantine, fast was an option. Over the following months, Vane ran a campaign through the Caribbean that demonstrated almost every principle we have been discussing. He used shallow coastal waters to avoid naval pursuit. He identified and intercepted targets using the windward positioning tactics we described. He varied his routes in ways that made him difficult to predict. He was eventually captured, but not because his tactics failed. He was captured because of a storm that dismasted his ship and stranded him on an island, after which he was recognized and arrested. The sea itself did what the Royal Navy could not. This brings us to the opposition side of the story. Because the brigantine's advantages did not go unnoticed by the people trying to stop piracy, the Royal Navy and the colonial governments of the early 18th century were faced with a genuine tactical problem. Their standard warships, designed for fleet combat and European waters, were poorly suited to the brigantine-infested shallows of the Caribbean and the American coast. You cannot send a 60-gun ship of the line into shallow coastal water after a brigantine. The brigantine simply vanishes into water the warship cannot enter. The first real response was not a ship design change. It was an intelligence and politics change. The appointment of Woodes Rogers as governor of the Bahamas in 1718 was specifically intended to cut off the network of support that pirates depended on. Nassau had been a port where pirates could sell goods, find crew, repair ships, and get intelligence about targets. Rogers arrived with pardons for those who surrendered and a noose for those who did not. He cut off the base of operations. Several hundred pirates took the pardon. A few did not, and some of those, Vane included, ended up dead or caught within a few years. The second response was a ship design response. The Royal Navy developed and deployed the sloop of war, a vessel that sat between the small sloop and the larger frigate in terms of capability. Sloops of war were built with shallow drafts, high agility, and enough firepower to engage a pirate brigantine seriously. They were not as fast as a brigantine running before the wind, but they were faster than a frigate and could follow the brigantine into coastal waters that previously offered pirates a sanctuary. This changed the calculation dramatically. A pirate captain who used to be able to retreat into shallow water and wait out a pursuer now found that the pursuer could follow. The escape route was not automatically available, and a sloop of war with experienced naval crew and clear legal authority to destroy, rather than just capture, was a different kind of adversary than a merchant ship trying to flee. The third response was pure economics and manpower. Naval patrols along the major pirate operating zones were significantly increased after 1717 and 1718. Ships were stationed at key choke points. Communication between colonial governors improved. The intelligence networks that pirates depended on were disrupted and infiltrated. All of these responses together did not produce an immediate collapse of piracy. Bartholomew Roberts ran his extraordinary campaign right through this intensified period, from 1719 to 1722, which shows that a skilled, adaptable brigantine tactician could still operate even as conditions got harder. But the window was closing. Roberts was eventually caught in February of 1722 off the coast of West Africa by HMS Swallow, a ship specifically sent to hunt him. The engagement was won because Swallow's captain, Challoner Ogle, used excellent tactical judgment, positioning his ship downwind of Roberts' fleet in conditions where the pirates had been drinking heavily after a night of celebration. The specific brigantine advantages that had protected Roberts for 3 years were neutralized by superior naval intelligence, patience, and timing. Roberts was killed in the initial broadside exchange. His crew surrendered. 52 of them were subsequently hanged. That moment is often treated as the symbolic end of the golden age of piracy in the Atlantic and West African waters. It did not end piracy universally, but it effectively ended the brigantine-based raiding culture that had defined the previous 2 decades. The brigantine itself, however, did not disappear. It continued to be used by legitimate merchants, by naval scouts, by smugglers, and by later generations of Caribbean and South American pirates well into the 19th century. The vessel's fundamental advantages did not change. What changed was the operating environment. When the environment stopped providing the shallow water sanctuaries, the thin naval coverage, and the rich, predictable merchant targets that the Golden Age had offered, the brigantine stopped being the dominant raider platform. But let us take a step back here, because there is something worth understanding about what made the brigantine era so significant beyond the adventure narrative. The Golden Age pirates operating brigantines were not just criminals disrupting trade. They were, in a strange and uncomfortable way, a stress test of the early colonial trade system. The routes they exploited were routes where the protection of that trade had been assumed but not really provided. The shallow coastal waters they used as sanctuaries were regions where colonial authority existed on paper but often did not exist in practice. The merchant ships they caught were often sailing with minimal crew and minimal armament as a cost-cutting measure, based on the assumption that someone else was handling security. The brigantine revealed all of these gaps, not through political argument or economic theory, but through direct, violent demonstration. The response to the brigantine threat, the sloops of war, the reinforced patrols, the governor appointments, the intelligence improvements, was essentially the colonial system admitting that it had been underinvesting in the actual infrastructure of maritime safety and that the cost of that underinvestment had come due. In a purely mechanical sense, the brigantine also advanced the practical understanding of what a small, flexible, multi-use vessel could do. The hybrid rig concept that made the brigantine so adaptable influenced ship design for generations. Naval architects who studied why the brigantine was so effective at piracy took those lessons and applied them to legitimate military and commercial vessels. The schooner, which became the dominant fast vessel of the late 18th and early 19th century, was in many ways a direct descendant of the brigantine design philosophy. 2 masts, fore and aft emphasis, shallow draft, speed prioritized over cargo capacity. You can draw a fairly direct line from the pirate brigantines of Nassau in 1715 to the Baltimore clippers of the 1820s, the nimble schooners that carried dispatches and ran blockades during the American Civil War, and even some of the design principles in modern sailing yachts. The brigantine did not just influence piracy, it influenced maritime thinking, period. What also matters is the human element. The sailors who chose the brigantine, who mastered its specific tactical possibilities, who developed the doctrine of the windward position and the shallow water ambush and the psychological pressure campaign, these were people operating at a very high level of their particular craft. Whatever you think about piracy as a moral matter, and it was genuinely brutal and destructive in many specific cases, the sailors involved were not simply opportunistic thugs. They were skilled maritime professionals, applying real expertise to a specific problem in a specific environment. That is actually what makes the Golden Age brigantine story interesting beyond the theatrics. It is a story about how people with deep technical knowledge, operating in an environment that gave them specific structural advantages, created a tactical system that larger and better funded institutions struggled to counter for over 2 decades. The lesson is not that piracy was good or cool. The lesson is that institutional power is often slower to adapt than the people working against it, and that a small, fast, flexible system operated by experts can hold out longer than you would expect against a much larger, slower opponent. The brigantine made pirates deadly, not because it was the biggest or the most heavily armed ship in the water. It made them deadly because it was precisely suited to the specific conditions of the Golden Age Caribbean. Speed where speed was needed, shallow draft where shallows were the terrain, flexibility where wind conditions were unpredictable, and an intimidating enough presence to make the fight unnecessary in the first place. When the environment changed, when the shallows were patrolled, when the intelligence networks were disrupted, when the Navy built ships that could follow you into your own sanctuaries, the brigantines stopped being an overwhelming advantage and started being just another ship. That is not a failure of the vessel. That is the natural arc of tactical innovation. Something works. It dominates. The opposition adapts. A new equilibrium forms. The Golden Age pirates did not lose because they were bad sailors or because the brigantine was a bad ship. They lost because the world around them changed faster than they could adapt. And in that, honestly, their story is not so different from plenty of stories in business, politics, or warfare from any era. The tool that wins everything in one environment wins nothing in the next. What they left behind, though, was a pretty extraordinary 2-decade demonstration of what a well-designed, properly understood, expertly operated vessel could accomplish. The brigantine earned its reputation. Every Spanish Silver Fleet captain who saw that 2-masted silhouette coming fast off a headland understood that immediately. If you made it to the end of this one, thank you genuinely. This was a deep dive, and you stayed with it, which means you are exactly the kind of history lover this channel is built for. If you enjoyed this video and want to see more maritime history, naval tactics, and deep dives into the Golden Age of piracy, please subscribe, hit the like button, and drop a comment below telling us which pirate captain you would want us to cover next. Your comments directly shape what we make, and we read all of them. See you in the next one.